The story begins in the working-class neighborhoods of Montreal in the 1920s, where a young Maurice Richard first laced up his skates on frozen ponds. Born to humble parents in 1921, Maurice was one of 8 children in a typical French-Canadian family. From these modest beginnings, no one could have predicted that this boy would become not just a hockey legend, but a symbol of an entire people's struggle for respect and recognition. By his early 20s, Richard had joined the Montreal Canadiens, overcoming numerous injuries that nearly derailed his career before it began. His nickname, the Rocket, wasn't just for show. Richard played with an intensity that terrified opponents. His blazing speed, powerful shot, and fierce determination made him unstoppable on the ice. When Richard charged toward the net, his eyes burning with concentration, fans and players alike knew something special was about to happen. In the 1950s, Quebec existed in a strange limbo. While the province was predominantly French-speaking, economic and political power rested firmly in English hands. French Canadians often worked lower-paying jobs, took orders from English bosses, and were expected to assimilate rather than celebrate their culture. "Speak white" was a phrase commonly hurled at those who dared to speak French in public or professional settings, a cutting reminder of their second-class status in their own province. The National Hockey League mirrored these tensions. Though hockey was Canada's game, the NHL remained an old boys club run almost exclusively by English Canadian and American interests. French Canadian players faced unofficial quotas, were paid less than their English counterparts, and endured constant discrimination both on and off the ice. Officials seemed quicker to penalize French players, and advancement to coaching or management positions was virtually impossible for them. What made Maurice Richard different was his refusal to accept the status quo. Unlike previous French-Canadian stars who kept their heads down, Richard openly challenged unfair treatment. He spoke out in French newspapers about double standards and how he was officiated compared to English players. He refused to hide his frustration when opponents targeted him with racial slurs and cheap shots. In a league where French-Canadian players were expected to be grateful for the opportunity and not make waves, Richard made tsunami-sized waves. To the people of Quebec, Richard represented something far beyond athletic excellence. In an era when French Canadians had few public figures to look up to, Richard became their champion. When he scored, it wasn't just a point for the Canadians. It was a victory for every French-speaking person who had been told they weren't good enough. Children playing street hockey would all fight to play the role of Richard. His face adorned the walls of homes, shops, and churches throughout the province. The Rocket transcended sports to become a living symbol of French-Canadian pride and potential. By the mid-1950s, Richard was at the height of his power, leading the Canadiens toward what would become a dynasty. But tensions were building between Richard and the league, between French and English Canadian, and between the people and the systems that had kept them down for generations. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the simmering frustration. That spark would come on a cold March night in 1955, when an on-ice incident would transform a hockey star into the unlikely catalyst for a social revolution. The date was March 13, 1955. The Montreal Canadiens faced off against the Boston Bruins in what started as just another regular season game. The rivalry between these teams was already fierce, but nobody could have predicted how the particular match would change hockey in Quebec forever. The Boston Garden was packed with fans eager to see the league's biggest star, Maurice Richard, who was chasing yet another scoring title. Early in the game, Boston's Hal Laycoe struck Richard with a high stick, cutting him above the eye. In hockey's unwritten code, this demanded a response. When officials failed to call a penalty, Richard took matters into his own hands. After getting 5 stitches, he returned to the ice with blood still visible on his face and confronted Laycoe. A fight erupted, with sticks raised and gloves discarded on the ice. This type of altercation, while violent, was not uncommon in hockey at the time. What happened next, however, crossed the line. As linesman Cliff Thompson attempted to restrain Richard, the frustrated player struck the official. In the heat of the moment, with blood still dripping down his face, Richard had committed hockey's cardinal sin. He had laid hands on an official. Thompson would later claim Richard punched him twice, while Richard maintained he was simply trying to break free from what he perceived as a linesman unfairly restraining him while letting Laycoe continue to fight. The following day, NHL President Clarence Campbell announced an unprecedented punishment. Maurice Richard would be suspended for the remainder of the regular season and all playoff games. Never before had such a harsh penalty been levied against a star player. English-language newspapers largely supported the decision, calling it necessary to preserve respect for officials. French-language press, however, saw something else entirely, the English establishment once again putting a French Canadian in his place. The suspension came at a crucial time. Richard was leading the league in scoring and was poised to become the first NHL player to reach 50 goals in a season. The Canadiens were heading into the playoffs as favorites to win the Stanley Cup with the stroke of a pen. Campbell had not only derailed Richard's personal achievements, but potentially the Canadiens' championship hopes. To English Canada, this was justice. To French Canada, it was an outrage. The reaction in Quebec was immediate and fierce. Radio stations were flooded with angry callers. Newspaper editorials questioned Campbell's motives. People gathered in cafes and bars to discuss what many saw as a deliberate attempt to keep a French Canadian from making history. The suspension transcended sports, becoming a symbol of the broader injustices French Canadians face daily. The anger wasn't just about hockey. It was about decades of perceived oppression finally finding a focal point. Campbell, either oblivious to or dismissive of the growing tension, announced he would attend the next Canadiens' home game at the Montreal Forum as usual. This decision, seen as provocative and disrespectful, would prove to be the match that lit the powder keg. The people of Montreal, with Richard as their proxy, were about to send a message that would echo far beyond the world of sports. March 17, 1955, St. Patrick's Day, dawned with an unusual tension hanging over Montreal. The Canadiens were set to play the Detroit Red Wings that evening at the Montreal Forum, but hockey seemed almost secondary to the drama unfolding around Clarence Campbell's decision to attend the game. Throughout the day, local radio stations broadcast debates about Campbell's suspension of Richard and his planned appearance. Some called for calm, others for boycotts, but an unmistakable current of anger ran through the city. Outside the Forum, hours before game time, protesters began to gather. They carried signs in French and English condemning Campbell. Some distributed leaflets detailing Richard's unfair treatment. The crowd grew steadily, spilling onto STE Catherine Street and blocking traffic. Inside, as the teams warmed up, Forum staff noticed something unusual. Many ticket holders hadn't taken their seats. Instead, they lingered in the corridors, their conversations tense and animated. The usual pregame excitement had been replaced by a foreboding sense of anticipation. Midway through the first period, with Detroit already leading 2-0, Clarence Campbell entered the Forum. His timing could not have been worse, or perhaps more deliberate. He walked to his customary seat in the first balcony, easily visible to the crowd below. A chorus of boos cascaded down as fans spotted him. Some began to throw programs and food items in his direction. Campbell sat stoically, seemingly determined to project authority and normalcy. This show of indifference to the crowd's anger only intensified their fury. 20 minutes after Campbell's arrival, the situation exploded. A man approached the NHL president and slapped him across the face. Within seconds, a smoke bomb detonated on the Forum floor, filling the arena with thick, acrid smoke. Panic spread as fans rushed for the exits. The players, still on the ice, skated to their benches and then to their dressing rooms. The Forum's public address system crackled to life, instructing everyone to evacuate the building. The Montreal police, woefully understaffed for what was unfolding, struggled to maintain order. As fans poured onto STE Catherine Street, the riot spilled out of the Forum and into downtown Montreal. Store windows were smashed. Cars were overturned and set ablaze. The crowd, which had grown to thousands, moved like a wave through the downtown core. Their anger no longer directed solely at Campbell, but the entire system they felt had oppressed them. Police used tear gas and batons, but were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Newspaper accounts would later estimate the damage at over $100,000, the equivalent of nearly $1 million today. From his home in Montreal, Maurice Richard listened to reports of the chaos with growing horror. The man who had ignited this passion had never intended such destruction. Richard was a fighter on the ice, certainly, but he was also a family man, a devout Catholic, and someone who respected law and order. The reports of violence being committed in his name disturbed him deeply. He would later recall this as one of the most difficult nights of his life, torn between pride in his supporters' loyalty and shame at the destruction they wrought. By midnight, the riot had largely been contained, though pockets of unrest would continue through the early morning hours. The final tally, dozens injured, including several police officers, over 100 arrests, and a city forever changed. The game had been officially canceled and recorded as a forfeit in Detroit's favor. But the score of a hockey game seemed utterly insignificant compared to what had just transpired. What had begun as a sports controversy had morphed into something much more significant, the first major public uprising of French Canadians against the English-dominated power structure. The morning newspapers across Canada and the United States carried front-page headlines about the Richard Riot. Photos of burning cars and smashed storefronts accompanied accounts of the previous night's chaos. What many outside Quebec failed to grasp, however, was that this wasn't simply hooliganism or sports fanaticism gone awry. The riot represented the first tremors of a seismic shift in Quebec society. A people who had long accepted a subordinate status had finally found their voice, and that voice had roared through the streets of Montreal with a message that could no longer be ignored. The day after the riot, Maurice Richard broke his silence. In a radio address delivered in both French and English, he called for peace and an end to the violence. "I would like to ask everyone to get behind the team and to help the boys win a cup," he said in his characteristically straightforward manner. With those simple words, Richard demonstrated why he commanded such respect. Despite his own deep disappointment at the suspension, he put the team and the community ahead of his personal grievances. The violence immediately subsided. Richard had spoken, and his people had listened. What happened next would add another layer to the legend of the Rocket. Without their star player, the Montreal Canadiens rallied to win the Stanley Cup. When Richard appeared at the celebration, he received a thunderous ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. He hadn't scored a single goal in the finals, yet he was celebrated as if he had won the cup single-handedly. This moment symbolized Richard's unique status. He was more than a hockey player, more than even a cultural icon. He had become the embodiment of a people's potential and their refusal to be defined by others. Over the following years, historians and sociologists would come to view the Richard Riot as a pivotal moment in Quebec's history, the spark that helped ignite what would later be called La Révolution Tranquille, the Quiet Revolution. This period, beginning in the late 1950s and continuing through the 1960s, saw dramatic social and political changes in Quebec. French Canadians demanded greater control over their economy, politics, and culture. The Catholic Church's grip on education and social services loosened. The provincial government under Jean Lesage adopted the slogan Maître chez nous, masters in our own house, a sentiment that echoed the pride Richard had instilled years earlier. The impact of the Richard Riot reached far beyond hockey and into every aspect of Quebec society. Language laws were enacted to protect and promote French. Educational reforms created a more accessible system for French-speaking students. Political movements advocating for Quebec's sovereignty gained momentum. Business leaders pushed to break the English monopoly on economic power. Young French Canadians began to see paths to success that hadn't existed for their parents. In each of these areas, the spirit that Richard represented, fierce pride, unwillingness to accept second-class status, determination in the face of obstacles, served as inspiration. Maurice Richard himself remained somewhat uncomfortable with his role as a revolutionary figure. Throughout his life, he maintained that he had been simply a hockey player who wanted to be judged by the same standards as everyone else. This modesty only enhanced his appeal. Unlike politicians who sought power or intellectuals who spoke in abstract terms, Richard's demand for respect was visceral and authentic. He hadn't set out to change society, but his refusal to accept injustice resonated with people who had spent generations accommodating to an unequal system. The Quebec that emerged from the Quiet Revolution was dramatically different from the province that had existed before the Richard Riot. French was now the dominant language in business and government. French Canadians occupied positions of power in all sectors. Quebec's distinct culture was celebrated rather than suppressed. While these changes had many causes, the awakening of collective identity and dignity that occurred during the Richard Riot played a crucial role. A population that had experienced a taste of its own power would never again return to quiet submission. By the 1970s, the transformation was so complete that younger generations of Quebecois had difficulty imagining the world in which Maurice Richard had risen to prominence, a world where speaking French was considered a liability, where advancement required abandoning one's cultural identity, where even sports stars were expected to know their place. This amnesia was perhaps the greatest testament to the success of the revolution that Richard had helped to spark. What had once seemed impossible, a Quebec where French Canadians stood as equals, had become the new normal. Decades after the Richard Riot, its place in both sports and political history has only grown in significance. What started as a dispute over a hockey suspension has been recognized as a defining moment for an entire culture. Historians now place the Richard Riot alongside other pivotal events that shaped modern Quebec, from the 1970 October crisis to the sovereignty referendums. In each case, a population that had once been expected to remain quiet and accepting chose instead to assert its identity and demand recognition. The NHL itself underwent a transformation in the years following the riot. The league, forced to recognize the power of its French-Canadian fan base, gradually adjusted its practices. By the 1960s, French-Canadian officials were being hired. The dominance of English-speaking owners and executives slowly eroded. French-Canadian players no longer felt the need to adopt English names or hide their cultural identity. While the NHL never officially acknowledged that the Richard Riot had played a role in these changes, the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Maurice Richard's relationship with his own legacy remained complex throughout his life. He continued to insist that he had never intended to become a political figure, yet he seemed to understand the importance of his symbolic role. In the years after his retirement in 1960, Richard maintained a public presence that transcended the world of hockey. His voice carried weight on social issues. Politicians sought his endorsement. When he spoke about fairness and respect, people listened, regardless of their language or background. Though uncomfortable with being called a revolutionary, Richard embraced his position as a bridge between Quebec's past and its future. Richard's death in 2000 revealed just how deeply he had become woven into the fabric of Quebec identity. The province declared a state funeral, an honor typically reserved for heads of state. Over 115,000 people filed past his casket during the 2 days it lay in state at the Montreal Canadiens arena. Prime ministers, premiers, and cultural icons attended the service. Streets throughout Quebec were renamed in his honor. Statues were erected. His number 9 jersey, already retired by the Canadiens, became a ubiquitous symbol throughout the province, appearing on everything from license plates to public art. For modern hockey fans, especially those outside Quebec, it can be difficult to fully grasp the significance of Maurice Richard. His statistics, while impressive, 544 goals in an era when scoring was much more difficult, don't quite explain his legendary status. Many players have scored more goals, won more championships, and set more records. What makes Richard unique is that he was more than a hockey player. He was the embodiment of a cultural awakening. When French Canadians needed someone to show them that they could succeed on their own terms without compromising their identity, Richard provided that example. The narrative of Maurice Richard illustrates a universal truth about sports, that at their most meaningful, they are never just about the game. Sports can serve as a stage on which broader social dramas play out. The struggles that unfold on the ice, the field, or the court often mirror the larger conflicts taking place in society. In Richard's case, a hockey suspension became the catalyst for a profound social transformation, not because hockey itself was so important, but because the injustice Richard faced resonated with the everyday experiences of his people. Today, visitors to Montreal can see Richard's legacy in concrete form, in the statues and murals that bear his image, in the streets and arenas named for him. But his true legacy exists in something less tangible, the confidence and pride of people who learned through his example that they need not accept second-class status. The Montreal Riots of 1955 may have begun with a hockey suspension, but they evolved into something far more significant. The moment when a population long accustomed to accommodation decided that accommodation was no longer enough. And at the center of it all stood Maurice "Rocket" Richard, a hockey player who simply wanted to be treated fairly, and in doing so, inspired a nation to demand the same.